I'm here in Washington, D.C. to talk to two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist James Risen, author of several books including State of War, The Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration, and Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. Risen was not only relentlessly attacked under the Bush administration for his coverage of warrantless wiretapping, but was subpoenaed by the Obama administration over his expose on a botched CIA sabotage operation in Iran. He went rogue and published a story in his book after the U.S. government got the New York Times to kill it. Threatened with jail time from the government, Risen went through 7 years of legal battles to protect his source. In the face of this repression, he never compromised their identity. As one of the nation's leading voices on the national security state, I sat down with Risen to talk about his experience being targeted and what he's exposed that's put him in the crosshairs of the U.S. empire. So you're here, you're not behind bars. How does it feel for the first time in a while to not have the government trying to arrest you?
It's good. I mean, it took 7 years, I think they were after me, and finally they dropped the case. They dropped coming after me, and I feel like I beat them, you know, and it did, I think it's forced at least the Obama administration and the Justice Department to step back and back off reporters. So I hope that's the legacy of my case, is that they don't try to do this to some other reporter.
It is truly fascinating. I mean, what kind of precedent does that set for the government to enlist charges not only against the alleged leaker, but the journalist who was simply publishing the leaks?
Yeah, I mean, my case started in the Bush administration, and at first they threatened me with, the Bush administration threatened to use the Espionage Act against me, and they threatened me with, they were going to charge me with obstruction of justice when I refused to cooperate. And they called me, you know, they told my lawyers at first they weren't sure whether they were going to prosecute me individually. And so it was a very long marathon of dealing with the government, and I think I finally got them to back off, and it was exhausting. So.
And let's talk about the subpoena that came against you, James. You say that it was not only used to use you to build a case against the alleged source of yours, but also just to target you for your work.
Yeah, I think the background of the story is that in 2005, we Eric Lischblau and I broke the story of the NSA's domestic spying by the Bush administration, and that was in my book, State of War. And then I think the government, the Bush administration, was furious that we broke that story and we disclosed the existence of the NSA domestic spying. And so I think they were looking for something else to get me on. I think they decided they didn't want to come after the New York Times on the NSA story because it was such a big constitutional issue. And so I think they were looking for other ways to come after me. And so I think they looked through my book, State of War, and tried to find things to investigate. And I know that they conducted leak investigations of at least 3 different chapters before they decided which one to come after me on. So they were looking for something to get me on, to try to isolate me from the New York Times.
Let's talk about this story briefly, because it's absolutely fascinating. New York Times was threatened by the Bush administration. They held onto this story for over a year, James, about Stellar Wind, the post-9/11 warrantless wiretapping program.
Right.
How did you finally get that story published?
Well, what happened was in 2004 we found out about it. We wrote a story and called the CIA and the White House and the NSA for comment. And immediately the Bush administration started a full-out lobbying effort to stop the New York Times from publishing the story, and they agreed not to run the story right before the 2004 presidential election. And then Eric Lischblau and I, right after the election, after that decision, we tried to get the editors to let us try again, and they did. They said, okay. And so we did more reporting and more writing, and then we presented it again to them in December 2004, and they again said no, under pressure from the Bush administration. And so I decided to put it in my book, State of War, and then when I had finished writing the book, I told the editors, it's going to be in my book. You should publish it now. And there was a lot of, they were furious at me. And we had a long series of very contentious meetings about that. And finally, my book was coming out in January 2006. And they ran the story in mid-December 2005. So.
Unbelievable. You know, I think people might find it hard to believe that Bush administration officials actually threatened the New York Times, and not just the New York Times, several media organizations, with actually blood on their hands from future terrorist attacks. I mean, talk about kind of this culture of censorship and how it operates on behalf of the government, especially in a post-9/11 era.
They would constantly say that this was the crown jewel of the counterterrorism program, and that if we revealed it, that we would be aiding the terrorists, and that the next terrorist attack would be our fault. And it was just this all full-out campaign to try to convince the New York Times that if they, wrote stories, they would be responsible for Americans dying. And I think they did that with other media organizations too. And it was just, the editors went along with it for a while, and then after a while they began to realize, we can't keep going along with these kind of efforts by the Bush administration.
Yeah, it seemed like there was this culture of stenography almost to a certain extent, and you describe, you couldn't sit with this story, especially in the wake of the New York Times, Judith Miller, all these people kind of perpetrating the WMD's story. And, they said it was the crown jewel. They said it was essential for their terrorism efforts or counterterrorism efforts. Why did you disagree, James?
Well, we had a lot of sources. Eric Lischbaugh and I had a lot of sources who were telling us they thought that this program, the NSA program, was illegal or unconstitutional. And so I thought that was the argument. That was the reason to write the story. What we were revealing was that they were using illegal or unconstitutional means to surveil people electronically. Everybody knows that the government conducts surveillance. So we weren't revealing the existence of surveillance that nobody knew about. What we were revealing was that the government was going around the law. And so I always thought that the argument that this is somehow damaging national security was false, because it was, we were just describing, we weren't saying, okay, they're spying on this guy and he doesn't know it. What we were saying is they're going around congressional law to do this in a way that a lot of people within the government think is unconstitutional. So I thought that was a natural story that should be written.
The person accused of being your source, Sterling, was convicted of 9 counts under the Espionage Act. You've called Obama the greatest threat to press freedom in a generation. You've called Eric Holder his chief censorship officer. What earned them these titles?
The Obama administration continued to target journalists and whistleblowers in a way that is unprecedented in modern American history, going back to at least the Nixon administration. They used the Justice Department to crack down on aggressive investigative reporting by issuing subpoenas to reporters, not just me, but to other people, and by prosecuting whistleblowers. They've prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined in the history of the United States. And they have cracked down on aggressive investigative reporting in a way that no one has since Nixon. So I think that's why I said what I did, because they have shown a real zealous approach to going after journalism.
Were you surprised when Obama continued and in some cases exacerbated that war on whistleblowers?
Yes, I was shocked that in my case, they subpoenaed me, and the Bush administration subpoenaed me, and I thought when Obama came in they were going to drop the case, and instead they continued it and was even more. They were even more aggressive about not just me, but other cases since then. So I still don't quite understand why a supposedly liberal democratic administration did this.
So-called most transparent administration, right?
Right.
You know, what was so important about that Iran story in your book that you felt it needed to be published, and even risking that culture of censorship again?
Well, as I said in some of the affidavits in my case, you know, this became I actually had to write affidavits to the court explaining that. Why did I think this was important? Basically, if you remember, in 2003, we went to war with Iraq based on faulty intelligence over whether or not Iraq had a nuclear weapons program or a biological or chemical weapons programs. And so at the time, the next war that seemed like it was about to happen was war with Iran. Were we going to go to war with Iran over what people said was their nuclear weapons program? And at the time, you know, there were all these hyped arguments about the state of Iran's nuclear weapons program. And so I thought it was very important to show how flawed the U.S. were. And this operation, which was botched and poorly managed, shows how badly flawed the CIA's efforts at understanding the Iran program was. And I thought that was critical at a time when the debate was all about, okay, what do we do about Iran and what do we do about their nuclear weapons program? And after my book, the 2007 National Intelligence course on what the CIA thought was the status of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. They showed for the first time in 2007 in that National Intelligence estimate that the Iranians had not built a bomb, that they had stopped work on an actual weapons program. And that was a complete reversal from the intelligence at the time I wrote my book, which I thought vindicated what I had written. It showed that they were admitting themselves how flawed their previous intelligence was.
Mm-hmm. It seems like there are two kind of anonymous government sources here in D.C. when it comes to the culture of journalism. Those approved and many times planted by government officials to bolster themselves, and then, of course, insiders, whistleblowers who are trying to expose government wrongdoings. How would you describe this kind of dichotomous culture in D.C. and the kind of opposite ways that they're treated?
Oh, I think that's a good way to put it. I think there are different kinds of leaks. You can tell, and if you've been here a while, you can tell the difference. You can tell, given the context and the news flow, when something is being leaked officially by the White House or by the Pentagon or something. And then you can see when the stories that are inconvenient to everybody come, and people begin to complain about whistleblowers. Oh, those, and so it's very easy to tell, and it's usually a difference that the official leaks from the White House don't get prosecuted and they don't get investigated, and nobody wants to get to the bottom of why those leaks came out, because it's not in the interests of the powerful people in the government to reveal themselves as the leakers. And it's only the cases where it's somebody else or it's something that's inconvenient that they have this zealous prosecutorial approach to trying to find out who's talking. And that's why I have often said that the whole purpose of these leak investigations is to force journalists to only go down accepted paths of reporting. If you stay within a certain parameter of covering national security affairs that is the official sanctioned path, then you won't have any problems. They'll never subpoena you, they'll never investigate your stories. But if you go off and try to do stories and aggressively investigate things that they don't want you to investigate, then you'll be punished.
You've extensively reported on the national security gold rush, as you've called it, this permanent war economy. But within this vortex is, of course, endless corruption, mismanagement of funds. So many instances of this in your book, but let's just talk about the huge racket to line the coffers of private defense contractors in Iraq, from KBR DynCorp to Blackwater. Of course, KBR and DynCorp's cover-ups were overshadowed by Blackwater's over-the-top criminality. But you cite one military official that says KBR ran Iraq. At the height of the war, managed 4,000 buildings, 35,000 container housing units across the country. During this time, several cover-ups of KBR's criminal negligence. Talk about the electrocution scandal and what the government did to help KBR avoid accountability.
Yeah, well, that's one of the more tragic, really sad stories of the Iraq War was in 2000, I think it was 2008, Staff Sergeant Ryan Maseth, who was a Green Beret, was taking a shower in his barracks outside Baghdad and was electrocuted. And his mother was told that he had died in Iraq, but didn't get very many straight answers. And she was a woman from Pittsburgh who was really not willing to just, take the military at their face value.
What did the military tell them happened?
Well, at first their story kept changing about what happened. I think at first they said he brought in a hairdryer into his shower and that he had killed himself with that. And then when they backed off that, said, no, there was just a poor, there was a wire hanging out or something like that. And she just said, well, your stories don't make sense, and began to look into this. And it turned out that there were soldiers being electrocuted all over Iraq that nobody realized. And I found, for instance, that there had been alerts sent out years earlier about safety problems, and nobody had totally ignored. And I think there were 18 soldiers, U.S. soldiers, who had been killed in Iraq by electrocution, and nobody had ever looked at that issue. It was just happening all the time, and people were just saying, oh, well, that's too bad. And I really think that if she hadn't asked questions, a lot of this, would never have been uncovered.
Did the government know about this?
Well, that's the question. That's one of the things that's been investigated. There was she had, and I document this in Pay Any Price, there was a possibility of a criminal investigation of KBR by the Army criminal investigators. And she was told that they were going to declare her son's death as to be negligent homicide by KBR, and then that ruling was never issued, she believes that the criminal inspectors were overruled, and she was told, if you really want justice in this case, you're going to have to go to the civil courts.
Even if the government didn't know, it's still just outrageous that there was not more management of how these things were being constructed and oversight.
They gave KBR this contract to basically run everything. And there's this other case where I talk about the auditor for the Army who was in charge of the contract for KBR initially for Iraq. They were given basically the contract to cover all basic services for U.S. troops in Iraq. And it was, at first, nobody realized how big that was going to be. And then as the contract kept exploding in size, this auditor at the Army at Rock Island, where they did the auditing of what they call LogCap, which was the main KBR contract, he said, he kept telling KBR, you haven't given us any bills to explain all the costs that you're billing us for. You haven't given us any records. And they kept refusing for like a year. And finally he said, I'm going to deny your costs, the payment to you, because you're not giving me any records to back up any of your bills. And the next thing he knew, he got fired. I got pushed out of that job. And so that's the kind of thing that was going on behind the scenes.
You know, I know that this is a huge story, obviously, so let's try to truncate this down, but I can't not ask you about this because I was stunned to learn in your book the extensive government infiltration and impediment to the 9/11 victims' families' lawsuit against Saudi Arabia right from the get-go. I mean, how did the government insert itself to exploit that lawsuit from the get-go, and why do you think it did this?
It's a real mystery. There are a lot of questions about that I tried to just raise a lot of questions about what was going on, because to me it was one of the great mysteries of the post 9/11 age of what was really happening in that case. Clearly, at some level, some of the investigators involved in the 9/11 lawsuit also were working in parallel with the U.S. government on some things. There was, and I know that the lawyers involved in the lawsuit, some of them were furious when they figured this out. And it's totally unclear what was really going on. But to me, that was like a metaphor for the post 9/11 age, is that the war on terror became so crazy that you really don't know what's going on anymore. It's just this massive thing that we now live with, that's taken over so much of our lives that we still don't fully understand the full breadth and scope of what is the war on terror today. And that's what I was trying to get at, is just the kind of the Kafkaesque nature of what we're trying to do as a country on counterterrorism.
Because, you know, of course the rationale for not preventing 9/11 was all these different agencies couldn't get the information to each other. But then you have, after 9/11, this insane, massive apparatus that seems like it's almost more obfuscated, more confusing. You talk about
I mean, what happened after 9/11, Congress said, okay, how much money do you need? And then
the blank check.
A blank check we've had a blank check for 15 years on terrorism. And these agencies, at least, especially in the first few years, they had no idea what to do. And they were being given more money than they knew what to do with. And people were saying, if you have an idea, go do it. And that was, and here's a blank check. And that's the way it was being operated on.
You were targeted under the war on terror in Iraq when we were going after Al-Qaeda. Now we're going after ISIS, kind of this ubiquitous threat, justifying an endless military operation now in the Middle East and beyond. Trump has said he wants to carpet bomb Syria and Iraq. Hillary's talking about putting 10,000 troops on the ground already. How does this kind of foreboding premonition fit into what you describe as kind of the empire's policy of?
Yeah, keep. And we've tortured people. We've, killed thousands of people over the last 15 years, many innocent people in lots of different countries. And Americans don't want to admit that our actions have consequences. Politically, it's very difficult in the American. The reason somebody's mad at us, killed, or we bombed their hometown, or something like that, or that people are being radicalized because Muslims are being radicalized because they're angry about what happened in some country that we bombed. But if you look at virtually every lone wolf or every Muslim extremist who has had an attack in the United States, almost all of them talk about how they're mad at what the United States has done in the Muslim world. And we ignore that. We ignore what they say is the reason. And so we keep having these silly arguments about how, why do they hate us? They hate our values. No. The real reason is because we have bombed their countries, attacked them, killed many, thousands of people, many innocent, and we've angered, we've led to resentment. Our drones are like an imperial weapon. So, I mean, I think until we, as a country, recognize that, we're not going to get out of this cycle.
You said it yourself that a permanent war economy cannot last.
Right, right. I mean, this is what happened to the Roman Empire. And it's what happened to the British Empire. They bankrupt themselves eventually in long wars, long periods of war. And I think that's the ultimate end if we continue this.